Isaiah 61:3 describes God as one who gives beauty for ashes, who brings transformation not by erasing suffering, but by working within it to create something new. That passage captures the heart of this presentation. When we speak of post-traumatic growth, we're not describing a denial of trauma or by just getting over it. We're examining the complex process through which meaning, identity, and resilience can emerge in the aftermath of profound harm. Life beyond the chaos reflects this reality. Child abuse introduces chaos into development. It disrupts identity and emotions and relationships at the most formative stages of life. Yet, many women do not remain defined by this chaos. Through meaning making, identity reconstruction, relational repair, and spiritual integration, some experience growth that coexists with their pain and extends beyond it. Today's presentation explores how adult women who survive child abuse move from chaos towards growth, what the literature reveals about these pathways of transformation, and how clinicians can support it. We'll move through 6 key areas today. First, we'll discuss the topic of study itself and why post-traumatic growth is an important framework. Then we'll define our specific population of women who survive child abuse. Next, we'll analyze the variables that research identifies as central to post-traumatic growth development to see how they form the foundation. We will also explore how biblical frameworks intersect with these empirical findings, identify critical directions for research, and conclude by bringing these elements together for a comprehensive understanding of post-traumatic growth in this population. Let's begin by discussing the topic of study. Chaos in the context of childhood trauma describes the profound disruption that occurs when abuse enters the story of a child. Olf explains that women who are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop PTSD following trauma exposure, which reflects how deeply these early experiences shape identity, emotional regulation, and relational safety. Yet what is equally important is that this is not the end of their story. Studies by Hoskins and Morash, along with Jonsdottir and colleagues, consistently show that many women also report meaningful emotional, relational, and even spiritual growth in adulthood. For many women, child abuse functions like a veil that settles over them during critical developmental periods. It shapes their identity formation. It interrupts this emotional regulation, and it complicates the capacity to trust people and to form meaningful connections. This veil does not erase a woman's God-given identity, but it does distort it. It distorts her ability to see herself as God does, fearfully and wonderfully made, as affirmed in Psalms 139:14. It is important to note that under supportive relational, environmental, and clinical conditions, this veil can begin to lift. And as it does, women often start to recover a sense of who they are, not defined by trauma anymore, but aligned with who God created them to be. This is the beginning of renewed identity, clarity, and the emergence of post-traumatic growth. So why focus on women? Well, like I mentioned before, women are 2 to 3 times more likely than men to develop PTSD following trauma. They experience high rates of early interpersonal trauma, and child abuse profoundly shapes lifelong functioning across multiple domains. And because post-traumatic growth involves identity reconstruction, meaning making, and relational transformation, this population becomes uniquely important for understanding how growth can emerge after developmental trauma. Child abuse disrupts core developmental processes, like I mentioned before. It does affect identity formation, emotional regulation, relational safety, and it can last over the lifespan. So for many women, early interpersonal trauma leads to fragmented self-concepts, persistent difficulties with emotional regulation, and profound challenges with trust and boundaries. These patterns often continue into adulthood. They influence how survivors navigate stress, relationship, and intimacy throughout their lives. Yet, here's the beautiful thing here, is that the very domains that are disrupted by trauma, identity, emotions, relations, are often where post-traumatic growth later emerges. Research with women who survived child sexual abuse documents growth through reclaiming their identity, developing emotional resilience, building healthy relationships, and redefining meaning and purpose. So this suggests that while trauma reshapes developmental pathways, it can also create conditions where profound transformation becomes possible. Despite the profound impact of child abuse, many adult women demonstrate remarkable pathways of growth. Research consistently shows survivors undergo meaningful identity shifts. They develop this stronger and more coherent sense of self. And many cultivate enhanced emotional and psychological resilience, and many develop deeper relational capacity marked by empathy, clearer boundaries, and a greater intentionality about being connected to others. These patterns highlight that trauma doesn't determine the endpoint of a woman's story. So, why is this important? Why is post-traumatic growth important? Well, first, let's say it's not universal. Research demonstrates that many women experience significant growth, but this happens through several interconnected processes. Like I've mentioned before, and we are going to continue to hear this over again, it's through meaning making, identity reconstruction, cognitive and emotional transformation, relational healing, spiritual growth, and the strengthened resilience and coping. Studies by Raffaelli and Shire, Tan and Barlas, and Vander Wethuizen document these patterns across diverse samples. Growth emerges when survivors have cognitive, emotional, relational, and spiritual resources to engage meaningfully with their trauma histories. Let me say that again. When survivors have cognitive, emotional, relational, and spiritual resources to engage meaningful with their trauma histories, that's when growth emerges. So let's dig into this population a little more specifically. Our population today of interest is adult women who survived child abuse, and that covers physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. These early interpersonal traumas occurred during formative developmental years. They shape their identity, the emotional regulation, the relational functioning across the lifespan. But because post-traumatic growth specifically involves identity reconstruction, meaning making, and relational transformation, this becomes uniquely important for us to understand how growth can emerge following developmental trauma. Although child abuse does result in profound psychological harm, what the research consistently shows is that many women also report meaningful positive changes in adulthood. Studies by Hoskins and Morash, Jansdottir, and colleagues document identity shifts, increased resilience, and enhanced relational capacity among women who survived child maltreatment. This dual reality, significant harm alongside meaningful growth, makes this population particularly important for examining how post-traumatic growth emerges. So, while post-traumatic growth isn't universal, studies do demonstrate that many women who experience child abuse develop significant growth in adulthood. Jansdottir and colleagues found that survivors of sexual violence show meaningful post-traumatic growth patterns, particularly in relational and spiritual domains. Raffaelli and Shire documented identity shifts and resilience among young women who survived child sexual abuse. These findings show that post-traumatic growth is not only theoretically possible, but empirically observable in this population. When we look specifically at women in high-risk environments, such as probation, parole, chronic adversity, identity work still emerges as a central theme. Hoskins and Morash found that even with ongoing stressors, many women were actively rebuilding this sense of self, stronger, more grounded, and more discerning about their relationships and purpose. And what stands out here is that growth did not wait until life became easy. Identity reconstruction was happening alongside distress, not after it ended. Lahav and colleagues help us understand why post-traumatic growth never follows this clean, linear path. Women who experience both childhood sexual abuse and later re-victimization often report strong post-traumatic growth indicators. Yet they also indicate elevated distress. What they found is that mild dissociation sometimes provided a mental space for coping and meaning construction, while severe dissociation interrupted in the integration of post-traumatic growth. This reinforces that post-traumatic growth and pain can coexist, and clinical work must consider the survivor's inner world, not just the trauma history. So looking at the severity of dissociation and where they are on this, and are they ready to be able to make sense of the trauma? Across samples of young adults with childhood maltreatment, we see consistent patterns. Post-traumatic growth is strengthened by resilience, optimism, and strong social support. Moore and Rosen found that these protective factors help women reinterpret their trauma stories in more coherent and empowering ways. What's encouraging is that while all three factors, resilience, optimism, and connection, can be nurtured within the therapeutic relationship and supportive context. And one of the most meaningful findings across literature is that post-traumatic growth is not limited to women with a single trauma. Jarek and Saunders demonstrated that women who endured multiple forms of adversity, abuse, harassment, discrimination, still described growth. For many, these layers of trauma produced clearer boundaries, greater self-reliance, and a deep desire to help others. Again, growth did not erase suffering, but it did grow and come out of women who were able to reclaim their agency in their stories. Guggenberg and colleagues review reinforces how relational and contextual post-traumatic growth truly is. This idea of identity repair, relational trust, and meaning making were deeply shaped by the women's environments, how family, community, culture responded to their stories. Post-traumatic growth flourished when women were believed, they were supported, and they were empowered. But it stalled when they were faced with stigma or minimization or were not believed. Post-traumatic growth is never just an internal process. It unfolds within real, socially supportive environments that either nourish or silence healing. Now, when we look across these studies collectively, we start to see a little bit more of a complete picture of our population. Adult women who survived trauma or childhood trauma often carry complex trauma histories, yet many also show remarkable pathways of post-traumatic growth. Their growth tends to appear in places where trauma once disrupted their identity, relationships, and meaning, and it often unfolds while distress is still present, not after it ends. Adult women with histories of childhood abuse show this distinct post-traumatic growth patterns across their identity, meaning, relationships, and resilience. Like we said before, post-traumatic growth is not universal, but when it is present, it reflects this deep cognitive, emotional, and spiritual reconstruction. It often emerges alongside ongoing distress, not after healing is complete. So we see that post-traumatic growth does not develop in isolation. We know that supportive environments, access to community, and the presence of validating relationships make growth more possible, while stigma and isolation can halt it. Many women, spirituality becomes a central framework for making sense of suffering, rebuilding identity, and reconnecting with hope. Together, these studies remind us that the women at the center of this presentation are not simply trauma survivors. They are individuals navigating profound reconstruction across their life. It's shaped by their histories, their environment, and the meaning that they make along the way. As we understand these women and the context they carry allows us to take the next step. We can examine what actually contributes to post-traumatic growth, the psychological, emotional, relational, and spiritual variables that shape how growth unfolds. Now let's take a look at the variables connected to post-traumatic growth. So let's take a quick little stop here to look at the post-traumatic growth inventory. Many of our studies use this, and there's a couple things that I want to point out here. So it was developed by Tedeschi and Calhoun in 1996, and it remains the foundational measure for post-traumatic growth and identifies 5 domains. And those are new possibilities, relating to others, personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation of life. When looking at the post-traumatic growth literature in the last 5 years, specifically on adult women who survived child abuse, a clear pattern emerged, and the domains identified in these studies do map closely to the PTGI's 5 factors. What in the research for this presentation, though, that emerged was 6 themes, and they showed up again and again in the research on post-traumatic growth in adult women who survived childhood abuse. So across the diversity of research, these themes started to emerge: meaning making, identity reconstruction, cognitive and emotional transformation, relational healing, and spiritual growth, resilience, and coping. And these themes line up with the 5 factors of the PTGI. When women talk about finding new meaning or reinterpreting their past, that does reflect new possibilities and appreciation of life. Rebuilding identity, coming to see themselves with strength and clarity, it mirrors the personal strength and new possibilities. The cognitive and emotional shifts we see in research align with personal strength. And relational healing, learning how to trust again, deepening empathy, and that connects directly to relating to others. And the spiritual changes described across these studies do match up with the PTGI spiritual change factor. Resilience and improved coping show up in both personal strength and appreciation of life. And taken together, this tells us something important, that the way women grow after childhood trauma is not random, isolated, or wishful thinking. They are consistent, measurable, and theoretically grounded, appearing across dozens of empirical studies. They're echoed in Tannenbarla's 2025 metasynthesis, and it reflects in the PTGI's validated framework. And so this body of research shows that PTG, or post-traumatic growth, in this population is not only possible, it's deeply meaningful, and it's expressed across every major dimension of a woman's life. We see it in their cognitive, emotional, relational, spiritual, and their personal strength. Now, the literature shows this pattern. Interpersonal trauma, especially sexual violence and child relational abuse, is linked to higher levels of post-traumatic growth. These trauma types rupture attachment, identity, belief systems, emotional regulation, and they create a deeper need for reinterpretation and rebuilding. As a result, survivors are more likely to report growth in personal strength, identity, clarity, relational insight, and boundary setting, and spiritual meaning or reorientation. Now, on the other hand, non-interpersonal traumas, so such as accidents, distress, illnesses, they also produce post-traumatic growth, but the pattern seems to look a little different. And in these survivors, or in these areas, the survivors are more likely to emphasize new possibilities, so life redirection, new goals, greater life appreciation, shifted priorities. And these patterns align with the broader PTGI factors and reflect the existential shock of surviving life-threatening experiences. Importantly, we notice that post-traumatic growth is not necessarily higher in these groups, but structurally different. So less identity focused and more life perspective focused. When we look across the research, post-traumatic growth doesn't appear uniformly across all trauma types. Studies repeatedly show that interpersonal trauma, especially sexual violence and childhood sexual abuse and chronic maltreatment, tend to produce some of the highest reported levels of post-traumatic growth. Jansdotter found that survivors of sexual violence often report stronger growth in relational and spiritual domains compared to survivors of other types of trauma. Similarly, we found Raphael and Schur showed that young women who survived sexual violence demonstrated a deeper identity and relationship-based growth than women exposed to other non-interpersonal traumas. So we start to see that the researchers emphasize that higher post-traumatic growth in these groups does not mean less suffering. Instead, it reflects this intense cognitive, emotional, and relational rebuilding that interpersonal trauma forces the survivor to do. So it creates the conditions in which meaning making and identity reconstruction really becomes essential. So across the research, post-traumatic growth does not appear evenly across trauma types. Again, we're going to go back to this interpersonal trauma, especially sexual violence, child abuse, and chronic relational harm. It often does produce a deeper, more noticeable growth in several post-traumatic growth domains. So this isn't because the survivors suffer less, like I mentioned before. It's because interpersonal trauma is disrupting those core places where post-traumatic growth is going to emerge later. So in the aftermath of an interpersonal trauma, identity is shaken, requiring survivors to rebuild who they are. Relationships and attachments are ruptured, which then prompts this new need for boundaries, empathy, and relational clarity. Meaning and worldview are challenged, leading to deeper reflection and purpose and reorientation. And then the spiritual beliefs are often re-examined and reshaped. So research supports this pattern that survivors of sexual violence report stronger growth in relational and spiritual domains. And young women with sexual trauma histories describe more profound identity and relational-based growth than those to the non-interpersonal trauma. So interpersonal trauma essentially creates this type of cognitive, emotional, and relational upheaval that makes post-traumatic growth, such as identity reconstruction, meaning making, and spiritual growth, more likely to emerge. Now, one of the most interesting patterns across the studies is this relationship between post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and post-traumatic growth. Several articles, most clearly Jan's daughter and colleagues, found that moderate levels of post-traumatic stress were associated with highest levels of post-traumatic growth. This reflects what researchers may call the sweet spot of distress. So too little distress, minimal cognitive engagement with the trauma. But if there's too much distress, they're overwhelmed, dysregulated, and unable to process them meaningfully. But if there's moderate distress, there's just enough activation to trigger reflection, meaning making, and identity reevaluation. So this supports this broader literature suggesting that post-traumatic growth often exists alongside ongoing symptoms rather than as their opposite. Now, not all internal responses support growth. The main one that we need to look at is dissociation, for example. It plays a complicated role. Lahav and colleagues found that mild dissociation sometimes helps survivors cope enough to process their experiences. However, if it was too severe, the dissociation was too severe, it significantly hindered post-traumatic growth, especially for women with re-victimization histories. So distress tolerance also shaped the post-traumatic growth pathway. Basharpour and colleagues found that high distress tolerance and self-compassion predicted more post-traumatic growth, while cognitive fusion, which means being stuck in rigid thoughts and this trauma-shaped thinking, it reduced the likelihood of growth. So together, these findings show that growth requires not just meaning making, but this internal capacity to stay present with those difficult emotions and being able to examine them. Henson and colleagues synthesized the post-traumatic growth literature and identified several core conditions that consistently support growth across trauma types. Post-traumatic growth was most likely when survivors engaged in deliberate meaning-making, received high-quality social support, and used adaptive coping strategy rather than avoidance. They also found that spiritual or existential processing, so someone trying to understand the suffering within a larger framework, that significantly contributed to post-traumatic growth. These findings mirror that what we see specifically in women surviving childhood abuse, that growth begins to emerge when internal cognitive work paired with relational and spiritual resources happen. Now, Henson followed up their study with looking at the barriers, so the following year. And so their colleagues in 2022 helped look at some of the barriers And this is so that we can understand the other side of the story. What they found was that post-traumatic growth is significantly hindered when survivors rely heavily on avoidance. They experience inadequate or negative social support or continue to face ongoing trauma or instability. They also highlight that shame, rigid beliefs, or unresolved dissociation can block cognitive restructuring needed for post-traumatic growth. So these findings align with what we see in childhood abuse survivors, that when early trauma has disrupted attachment, emotional regulation, and identity, survivors may need relational and structural safety before growth processes become possible. Now, when we pull all of this together, post-traumatic growth emerges as a dynamic process. It's shaped by multiple interacting variables. We could say moving parts. Trauma type matters. Is it interpersonal trauma, especially sexual trauma? This type of trauma seems to produce deeper identity, relational, and spiritual growth. Distress levels matter. Moderate symptoms tend to activate growth processes. Cognitive and emotional capacity matters. Dissociation, distress tolerance, and self-compassion, all of those influence that pathway to post-traumatic growth. Relational context matters as well. Are they in a place where they're being supported, they're being empowered? So across studies, the pattern is clear. Post-traumatic growth is most likely when women have the cognitive, emotional, relational, and spiritual resources to engage meaningfully with their trauma. Now let's take a look at the biblical. Romans 5:3-5 gives us a framework that does not minimize suffering. Paul writes that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope, and this hope does not put us to shame. This passage reflects a truth that many survivors intimately know, that God is able to meet us within suffering, and over time form qualities that could never have been developed in ease. Perseverance, depth of character, and a hope rooted not in circumstances, but in his divine love. Jean-Pierre de Caussade in The Sacrament of the Present Moment echoes the same spiritual trajectory. In his book, he teaches that when we surrender to God in the very moment we are living, even if it's painful, hidden, or ordinary ones, God is quietly at work. Suffering becomes not an endpoint, but a place where purpose is revealed, and the soul is slowly shaped into virtue. Together, Romans 5 and de Caussade give us a theological lens for understanding transformation even after trauma. They suggest that God does not cause suffering, but he works within it, or he can work within it. And so over time, the very places of deepest injury can become the places where perseverance is forged, character is deepened, and hope begins to rise again. In many ways, what Scripture and Christian spiritual writers describe as transformation through suffering mirrors what researchers identify as post-traumatic growth. When we look at the post-traumatic growth research in women who survived childhood abuse, we see a pattern. The studies show that spirituality often becomes central to meaning making and a mechanism after trauma. Van der Westenhuizen and his colleagues found that women who survived childhood sexual abuse and engaged in spiritual or religious practices were more likely to experience personal growth, reframe their trauma narratives, and to gain this sense of hope. And that's essentially what Romans 5 is saying. It's using essentially Romans 5 language in research form, suffering giving way to perseverance, character, and hope. Similarly, George and Bantz found that young women with histories of childhood sexual abuse use spiritual coping, such as prayer, faith, sensing God's presence to make meaning and even forgive and rediscover their purpose. This is exactly what de Caussade described. When we encounter God in the present moment, even inside painful moments, and we allow him to transform us, we are able to see grace. Bryant and colleagues showed that among African American women recovering from sexual assault, religious coping and supportive relationships helped reduce post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms over time. These women describe staying connected to faith, becoming stronger, and holding on to hope through God and community. Bass Sharper and colleagues found that distress tolerance and self-compassion predicted post-traumatic growth, while cognitive fusion, the rigid trauma-shaping thinking, reduced it. These qualities are psychological equivalents of perseverance, character, and hope. In other words, the research identifies the same pattern Paul names in Romans 5. Perseverance, forged in suffering, character shaped by endurance, and hope rising over time. Many women with histories of childhood abuse describe a long process of reconstructing identity. They move from a narrative of shame and worthlessness into dignity, clarity, and purpose. Hoskins Marash show that women are often integrate trauma into their identity in redemptive ways, especially when spiritual frameworks are present. Raffelli and Schur found that young women who survive sexual violence develop more identity-based and relational growth than those who with other trauma types, often supported by religious or spiritual meaning-making. Tan and Barlas identified identity, change, spiritual growth, and meaning-making over the core themes of post-traumatic growth. These map directly to de Cassade's insight that when we surrender to God in the present moment, it allows the soul to be reshaped, even in the aftermath of deep, deep harm. Now, one of the strongest findings across studies is that hope often grows slowly. It is rooted in meaning making and identity reconstruction rather than the circumstance. Vander Westhuizen and colleagues found spirituality provides a sense of future direction and hope in women recovering from childhood abuse. George and Vance noted that religious coping helped women find a sense of calling and purpose. This aligns beautifully with Romans 5, that hope is something formed through perseverance and character in the presence of God. Now, Scripture describes a transformation formed in suffering, perseverance, character, hope. And Christian spiritual writings describe a God who works within suffering to shape the soul. The research shows that among women with abuse histories, especially those who integrate their spirituality, post-traumatic growth often includes meaning-making, identity reconstruction, emotional and relational healing, spiritual growth, and renewed hope. The theological tradition and empirical literature are describing the same process through different languages. Now let's take a look at future research directions. As we look across the research on post-traumatic growth in women with histories of childhood abuse, four major gaps become clear. Studies repeatedly call for a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that drive post-traumatic growth. There's also this consensus that social and cultural factors shape post-traumatic growth outcomes. The researchers emphasize the need to examine trauma specifics and demographic differences. And finally, scholars across literature call for a stronger methodological designs to improve measurements and intervention development. One of the most consistent findings across literature is that mechanisms driving post-traumatic growth remain unclear. Jan's daughter and his colleagues found that growth varies based on trauma type and PTSD severity, suggesting deeper processes at work. While Tan and Barlas identified meaning-making, identity reconstruction, emotional regulation as central themes, yet noted that these mechanisms are insufficiently understood. Raffelli and Schur showed that the mechanisms of post-traumatic growth differ between sexual violence survivors and women with other types of other types. And Annunziato argues that post-traumatic growth is often measured without clarifying what actually produces transformation. So future research must address these core psychological, emotional, relational, and spiritual mechanisms. Social and cultural context does play a major role in shaping post-traumatic growth. In Iceland, post-traumatic growth patterns differ based on national religion and social norms. Among African American women, spiritual and communal coping pathways predicted reductions in post-traumatic stress disorder supporting long-term healing. George and Vance observed that young female survivors use spiritual coping to make meaning and rebuild identity. And while Van der Westhuizen and colleagues found that meaning-making processes were inseparable from culture and spiritual frameworks. Annunziato argues that post-traumatic growth research must incorporate cultural nuances rather than universal models. And what we see is post-traumatic growth is not uniform across trauma categories. We see that some women who survive sexual violence show deeper identity and relational post-traumatic growth than women who experience non-interpersonal. We also see that heightened post-traumatic growth in sexual violence survivors, particularly in relational and spiritual domains. And then we see that identity transformation, spiritual growth, can be a distinct outcome of childhood adversity. All of these, though, we still need to move beyond broad categories and study post-traumatic growth within specific populations and trauma types. Several scholars argue that post-traumatic growth research requires substantial methodological improvement. Jansdotter and colleagues noted challenges analyzing the post-traumatic growth subscales due to limited reliability. Tan and Barlas highlighted major variabilities in methodological quality across studies of adverse childhood experiences. And Van der Weytzen found inconsistencies in how meaning-making was conceptualized and measured. Henson and colleagues emphasized the need to distinguish authentic growth from early coping to protective illusions. All of this calls for significant refinement of post-traumatic growth constructs and improved measurement tools. There's also clear growing recognition that post-traumatic growth can be supported and not just observed. We see that self-compassion and distress tolerance can predict higher levels of PTHD, meaning that these are promising therapeutic targets. Spiritual integration, coping, seems to improve mental health outcomes over time. And identity and meaning-making and identity reconstruction seem to be modifiable areas of intervention as well. We also see that women in adverse environments can reconstruct their identity within the right relational and structural support. So all of these point to major opportunities, developing interventions that are tailored to survivors' trauma histories, cultural contexts, and their spiritual frameworks. Spirituality seems to have emerged, though, consistently as one of the strongest predictors of PTG, or post-traumatic growth, in women with abuse histories, yet it also is one of the least understood mechanisms. One study found that spiritual practices played a central role in meaning-making after childhood sexual abuse. Others show that spiritual coping helps survivors rebuild their identity, purpose, and hope, while others emphasize that there's a protective role of religious coping and support in faith communities. Spiritual change has in a major domain of post-traumatic growth following adverse childhood experiences. And so researchers need to include culturally and spiritually grounded dimensions in their future models. So across every article reviewed, these research priorities remain consistent. We need clearer mechanisms, deeper attention to cultural and social contexts, trauma-specific models, stronger methodological standards, and better interventions designed to support post-traumatic growth. And importantly, spirituality must become a more central focus of post-traumatic growth research, as it is one of the most influential yet understudied pathways for women who survive childhood abuse. So let's begin to wrap up today's presentation. Taken together, this presentation shows that while childhood abuse leaves deep and lasting wounds, many women also demonstrate meaningful forms of post-traumatic growth. The research is consistent in highlighting growth in identity, meaning-making, emotional regulation, relational capacity, and spiritual renewal. And these themes align with the validated domains of the PTGI and They echo the long-standing theological tradition that God can meet individuals within suffering and transform it over time. As we move forward, the task is to understand not only that post-traumatic growth occurs, but how, why, and under what conditions it can be supported. This intersection of psychology and spirituality and human resilience points us towards a richer clinical application and deeper opportunities for healing that go beyond the chaos. And thank you for today.